and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So this will be the last video of chapter 3. Yay! So we covered a lot in the last chapters. I know I give you a lot of anatomy. Feel free to rewatch the videos or to pause them and take some notes. So in this video, we will go over the cerebral cortex, which is also called the neocortex. So whenever we talk about cortex, we talk about the outer 6 layers of cells. However, subcortical structures are also sometimes referred to as cortex, so please don't get confused. Often these subcortical structures are called by their name and then with the word cortex behind it. So the human cortex is very large. It's about 2,500 square centimeters and it's only about 2 millimeters thick. So it's a really big sheet of brain tissue. The cortex contains 6 layers of gray matter, and it is very wrinkled so it can all fit into the skull. So our 2 hemispheres are almost symmetrical, and they have similar wrinkles in the cortex. However, there are some differences between the hemispheres, and there are also differences between people. So each hemisphere can be subdivided into 4 lobes. We already talked about this briefly, but you have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. So all these different wrinkles have names. So the little grooves or clefts in the cortex are called sulci. So you see them here. And the ridges are called gyri. So one of these is a sulcus and one of these is a gyrus. If the sulcus is deep enough to indent the ventricles, some people call them fissures, but I honestly just call them sulci as well. So the location, size, and shape of all of these differ in the 2 hemispheres, and they also differ in people. However, we should all have the same sulci and gyri, and you have the same sulci and gyri in both hemispheres. Okay. So this is a picture from the book. It is not the clearest picture, but I wanted to go over it first before going over different pictures. So here we're going to talk about the major sulci. So whenever you want to identify sulci and gyri, the first thing you look at is the central sulcus right here. It goes all the way from the top of the brain to the temporal lobe. In front of the central sulcus, you have the precentral sulcus. And after the central sulcus, you have the postcentral sulcus. Then you have the rest of the frontal lobe, and that can be divided further. Some people actually have 2 sulci here, some people have 3. In this picture there are 3, so let's go by that for now. So the top sulcus, you can divide this part in top, middle, and lower. The top one is called the superior frontal sulcus. The middle is called the middle frontal sulcus, and the inferior is called the inferior frontal sulcus. Then a division or the boundary between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe is called the lateral sulcus or lateral fissure. And then we can divide the temporal lobe up in 3 parts with 2 sulci. So you have the superior temporal and the inferior temporal. So remember, superior and inferior mean up and down. If there are 2 sulci in the frontal lobe rather than 3, we call it superior frontal and inferior frontal. Okay, so let's move on to the gyri. So the first thing you do is look at the central sulcus. Right in front of the central sulcus, you have the precentral gyrus. And behind the central sulcus, you have the postcentral gyrus. And then you can divide it up, the frontal lobe up in 3 other gyri. So you have the superior frontal gyri, middle frontal gyri, and the inferior frontal gyri. So the inferior frontal gyrus, you can split up into pars opicularis, pars triangularis, and pars orbitalis. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So moving on to the temporal lobe, you can split that up similarly as the frontal lobe in top, middle, and lower. So the top gyrus in the temporal lobe is called the superior temporal gyrus. Then we have the middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. Then all the way at the end of the central sulcus, you have the supramarginal gyrus. And all the way at the superior temporal sulcus, you have the angular gyrus. Right above that, you have the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. And then last but not least, in the occipital lobe, we often just call them lateral occipital gyri. Okay, so let's go back to the frontal lobe. So here it's not very clear, so I grabbed a picture from the internet to define it a little bit better. So here you can see this whole wiggle is the superior frontal gyrus, and here you have the middle frontal gyrus, and then here you have the inferior frontal gyrus. So the inferior frontal gyrus can be split up in three parts. You have the pars triangularis, which is the triangle, and then behind that you have the pars opercularis, and in front of that you have the pars orbitalis. So definitely remember these gyri. Okay, so the pictures from the book were not super clear, so I found this picture and I actually like this one for study purposes. So the first thing we always look at is the central sulcus. It's right here. In front of that you have the precentral gyrus and the precentral sulcus. Behind that you have the postcentral gyrus and the postcentral sulcus. Then moving on to the frontal lobe, this one only has two sulcus. So we have the superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus, and the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and this whole thing is the inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus can be split up into three parts. You have the pars triangularis, or in English, the triangular part. Then we have the pars opercularis, or the opercular part. And here we have the pars orbitalis, or the orbital part. Here you can see the central sulcus, and all the way at the end of the central sulcus you have the supramarginal gyrus. Then the temporal lobe can be split up into three gyri as well. We have the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus. And then those gyri are split up by sulci. So we have the inferior temporal sulcus, and superior temporal sulcus and inferior temporal sulcus. So at the end of the superior temporal sulcus, you have the angular gyrus. And then a little bit above that, you have the superior parietal lobule, and the intraparietal sulcus is right here. And what we did not cover yet was the last one, and we also did not cover the transverse occipital sulcus. And we also did not cover the cerebrocerebellar fissure, or cerebrocerebellar sulcus. This is a sulcus that splits up, or is the boundary between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And last but not least, we have the occipital gyri, or in this case they are called the lateral occipital gyri, since we're looking at the brain from a lateral view. So I highly recommend printing out this picture, widening out all the words, and studying from this picture. This picture is pretty clear with all the little drawings on it. I also highly recommend drawing it out yourself, because then you learn the fastest. Okay, so we only covered the lateral side of the brain. So this side of the brain, here you can see a real brain and a beautiful little brain, cerebellum, the brainstem. However, you can also look at this from a dorsal view, where you can see the similarity between the two hemispheres. You can look at it from a ventral view, which there are a couple of sulci and gyri that we did not cover, and the medial view, and again there are some sulci and gyri here that we did not cover. Okay, so the cerebral cortex or the cerebrum can be split up into 4 lobes. We have the frontal lobe, which is important for motor functions. So the motor cortex or primary motor cortex is right here. We have the parietal lobe, which is important for somatosensation or somatosensory functions. So body senses, and the primary somatosensory cortex is right here. Then we have the occipital lobe, it's important for vision, which is technically very funny because it's all the way in the back and your eyes are all the way at the front. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is important for a lot of things, including auditory functions and things like memory. Okay, so we have 3 types of cortex. So for each sense, we have a primary, secondary, and tertiary cortex. So the primary cortex receives the sensory input, the secondary interprets the sensory input and organizes what your body needs to do, and the tertiary kind of modulates between the secondary areas. So let's talk about this in an example of motor cortex. So motor cortex, you can see right here, the darker one is the primary motor cortex, the lighter one is the secondary, and right outside of it would be the tertiary. So the primary motor cortex, which you can see right here in the frontal lobe, would receive sensory input and projects it to the motor system. So it receives it from the motor systems and it sends it to the secondary output. Then the secondary cortex will interpret this input and it will organize our movement outputs, and that will send it to the tertiary cortex, and this modulates between secondary areas. So a little recap. Primary cortex, it receives sensory input. So here you can see that. So it receives it, then it sends it to the secondary areas. They interpret sensory inputs and they organize movement outputs. And then the tertiary cortex modulates between the secondary areas. Okay, so let's go over the 6 different layers of the cortex. So if you have motor cortex or sensory cortex, this is a little bit different, but we still have 6 layers in each. So the neurons in the neocortex are arranged in 6 layers. The layers function relate to their input and also to their output. So larger layers typically tell you that these cells are projecting in longer distances. So let's start off with cortical layer 5 and 6. So cortical layer 5 and 6, they're all the way at the bottom, and they send their axons to other brain areas. So this is especially large in the motor cortex, because the motor cortex will have to project all the way to the spinal cord. Axons in layer 4 receive input from the sensory system. So often layer 4 is a little bit smaller in the motor cortex and larger in the sensory cortex. So this layer will receive a lot of information from sensory areas such as vision, somatosensation, audition, and taste olfaction. And therefore, in the sensory cortex, it is larger. So cortical layers with a very thick 4th layer are also called agranular cortical areas. And then last but not least, the outer layers 1, 2, and 3 receive input from layer 4. In secondary and tertiary cortex, these layers are often larger than in primary cortex. So here you can technically see the differences between the motor and sensory cortex. So the biggest difference is layer 4 in motor cortex is small and it's larger in sensory cortex, and layer 5 and 6 are larger in motor cortex compared to sensory because they send their projections way further, because they send it all the way to the spinal cord. Okay, and I think this is the last slide, I'm not 100% sure. But the density of our cells are different in different regions. So a really long time ago, this led to the creation of a cytoarchitectonic brain map. It's called the Brodmann map. So we still use this map, even though this map is really old. This map divides the cortex in little subdivisions. And we call this the Brodmann map, and we still use this to communicate about areas. So different regions correspond to different functional divisions. So you don't have to memorize all these numbers. I just want you to know that certain Brodmann areas are important for certain functions. Oh, I think this might be the last slide. Okay, so for higher level functions, we need multiple brain areas to work together. So they need to communicate with one another. So for this, they need to be connected. So there are 4 different types of connections between neocortical regions. So the first one is the long connection between different lobes. The second one is short connections, which I normally call U fibers or arcuate fibers. The third type of connection is between the 2 hemispheres. So we'll talk about that later in this class. But a really big example is the corpus callosum, which is medially in the brain. And this is the biggest structure that holds the 2 hemispheres together. And then the fourth one is the connections through the thalamus. So a lot of input from our spinal cord, from our senses, goes into the thalamus and then towards the rest of the brain. So these are 4 very important types of connections within our brain. And then we have the crossed brain. So it is incredible how organized our brain is and how our hemispheres are almost symmetrical. So this is also because our brain has some form of contralateral organization. So each hemisphere responds to sensory stimulation of the other side, so the contralateral side of the body, and it also controls muscles of the contralateral side of the body. Funny, huh? So how does this work? So this is just one example. I put a picture up here of our brain, very schematic, and how our visual system works. So if you look at the image, this is an example of how 50% of our optic fibers cross over. So in the case of the eye, everything from your right visual field goes to your left hemisphere, and it comes from both eyes. So we're going to talk about this in way more detail, but I just want to talk about this really briefly right now. So everything from your right hemisphere or visual field, so you can see that in green, everything from here and here, from both eyes, will go eventually to the left side of the brain. And everything from the left visual field, in purple, will go to the right side of the brain. So each eye gets information from both visual fields, but eventually the right visual field will go to the left side of the brain and the left visual field will go to the right side of the brain. So here you can see that 50% of the optic fibers cross over. However, in motor and somatosensory fibers, 90% will cross over to the other side, so either in the brain or in the brainstem, but we will go over that in more detail later on during the class. Okay, and we made it to the end of the chapter. So I will see you guys back soon for the next chapter.